There are two popular and contradictory sayings about change. The first one goes like this: the only thing that stays the same is that everything changes. And the second states that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Tonight, I have a story, a parable of sorts, that illustrates that while everything does indeed change, many things stay the same. This story is about the space shuttle, one of the most sophisticated examples of human engineering. In particular, it concerns some of the interesting variables that were taken into account when designing the solid rocket boosters. In the end, the diameter of the solid rocket boosters was determined more by geography than anything else. The solid rocket boosters are manufactured in Utah by the Thiokol Corporation, and they are shipped completely assembled to Cape Canaveral in Florida. However, there is a small problem when you ship something that big from Utah to Florida. The Rocky Mountains are standing right in your way. And here's where geography comes in. The only way to ship something as big and heavy as a solid rocket booster is by rail. And the only way to get a rail car through the Rocky Mountains is to actually go through the Rocky Mountains, which means you have to get the rail car and the solid rocket booster through a tunnel. Now, we could end the story right here and have a chuckle about how funny it is that the rail tunnel determined the diameter of the solid rocket boosters, but the story doesn't end there. Now we have to ask, how was it decided to make the tunnels the size that they did? And the answer is pretty obvious. The tunnels were built to accommodate the rail cars in use at that time, which makes perfect sense. So what determined the size of the rail cars? The size of a rail car is largely limited by how wide its wheelbase is. If you make the rail car too wide or too tall, negotiating corners at speed gets tricky. The rail cars we have in this country roll on standard gauge track, which sets the rails 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. The thing is, we weren't the first country to build a national rail system. The Brits were. So when it came time to build ours, we did what any good organization does. We called in the consultants, who were the journeymen who laid down the track for the English railroad, and they told us that standard gauge sets the rails 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. Now, how was this decision made? It turns out that the decision was made for them since they built the passenger rail line to accommodate the locomotives that were already in use. These locomotives were being used to pull mining cars, and they simply started attaching passenger cars to them instead. Now, if you ask who decided the wheelbase on the locomotives, you might be surprised to learn that it was the rails that came first, and the locomotives were built to fit the rails that were already there. The rails had been built for carts that were being pulled by horses. The mine started using rails because it made the carts easier for the horses to pull them. Before there were rails, the miners adapted carts for use in the mines by putting gigantic wheels on them so they could roll over the rough terrain in the tunnels. But as you can imagine, a cart filled with ore could be pretty heavy, so the rails were a big improvement. The locomotive was simply built to replace the horse. The carts the miners used before there were rails were adapted from carts that were widely in use at the time, and all horse-drawn carts share approximately the same wheelbase. Not only did it make manufacturing the carts easier by building them all the same size, but it also helped with another serious problem that existed before there were paved roads. Having the same wheelbase allowed the carts to follow in the deep ruts that had been cut into the roads from centuries of use. If you built a cart that didn't track in the same ruts that were already there, it made it difficult for the horses to pull the carts, and you ran the risk of breaking a wheel. Those ruts are about 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. The English didn't build these roads. The Romans did, and they built them to accommodate the chariots they used. Those chariots were built to specifications decreed by Caesar, that all of his chariots would have the same wheelbase and be pulled by 2 horses. 4 feet 8.5 inches was apparently the size they picked. And so it has come to pass that because of one policy decision that was made thousands of years ago, critical design considerations involved in building this were, at least in some part, dictated by the dimensions of this. Not only did everything change, but many things stayed the same. In this story, we see what I call the 3 stages of organizational behavior. Behavior in any organization starts out as policy. It could be a formal stated policy or an informal policy, but once enough people are behaving in the same way, you have policy. In time, policy will be entrenched in the organizational culture as tradition, and ultimately the organization will build infrastructure to support their tradition. Successfully changing organizational behavior is dependent upon the state it's in. The further along the timeline we go, more time and energy is required to execute the change, and it is less likely that the organization will recognize the need for change. You see, we are told that policymakers need to have vision, but vision is overrated. Who could expect Caesar to have had enough vision to anticipate man would someday travel to a place it was impossible for him to even imagine existed? Instead, we undervalue what is really important, challenging policy while we still can. Why didn't someone ask why we had to follow the same old ruts in the road? Couldn't we have paved this instead? This unquestioned policy soon became the tradition as we began to build carts to conform to the status quo. And when the time came, no one thought twice about applying a permanent, fixed, unalterable solution to a fluid and changing situation. The tradition was literally cemented in place by infrastructure, ensuring that no matter how much things changed, at least this would remain the same. It is basic human nature to search for an oasis of permanence in the tumultuous, ever-changing world we live in, to build infrastructure around our traditions. But it only makes it more difficult when we want those traditions to change. When it comes to dealing with change, the most important question is and always has been, why? Not why change, but rather, why are we doing it this way now?